When you talk about the innate immune response, there are 5 different cells that are involved in this particular process right from the beginning. In all these 5 types of the innate lymphoid cells, we are talking about the lymphoid cells right now, they originate from this common lymphoid precursor cells or CLP. When we were discussing the cells, I had told you about different precursor cells that give rise to lymphoid cells, yes, and non-lymphoid cells. You already have gone through that. So this green one is a common lymphoid progenitor, lymphoid precursor cell, and under the influence of certain transcription factors, just like this one, NFIL3 or ID2, these are transcription factors, it differentiates to give rise to CILP, which is a common innate lymphocyte precursor. In this common innate lymphoid precursor cell is going to give rise to all of the lymphoid cells, the innate lymphoid cells. Okay? So they are all, because this CLP is going to differentiate along different lines to give rise to other lymphocytes. And along this line, when it is influenced by these transcription factors, it is going to give rise to CILP. And this CILP is differentiating into all these 5 different types of lymphoid, innate lymphoid cells. We call them ILCs, or innate lymphoid cells. Okay? So this CILP, again, you see that on the left side and down here is differentiating into 2 different population of cells. On one hand, under the influence of transcription factor NFIL3 and TOX, it is going to give rise to a natural killer cell precursor. And if it comes in contact with this transcription factor, GATA3, so it's going to give rise to CHILP, or the common helper innate lymphocyte precursor cell. Okay? This common helper innate lymphocyte precursor cell, or CHILP, is going to further differentiate into either LTIP or ILCP, or the innate lymphocyte precursor. Okay? This is LTIP, this is lymphoid tissue inducer precursor cell. This is an innate lymphoid cell. Okay? And this one is innate lymphocyte precursor. So this innate lymphocyte precursor is going to give rise to 3 different types of cells, which are known as ILC1, ILC2, and ILC3. ILC for innate lymphoid cell. Innate lymphoid cell 1, 2, and 3 coming out of the ILCP, this progenitor cell, precursor cell. Okay? And this one, the LTIP, lymphoid tissue inducer cell precursor, it is going to, differentiate into LTI, or the lymphoid tissue inducer cell. This is a precursor and this is a cell. These are the transcription factors responsible for this differentiation. So you see that along each arrow there are certain names written that you see here, certain abbreviations. All these are transcription factors. Okay? So if you see here, this is ILCP, or the innate lymphocyte precursor. It means this is the precursor of the lymphocytes. And the same cell, when it comes in contact with TBET and this transcription factor, will give rise to ILC1, but with a different set of transcription factor, it is going to give rise to a different lymphoid cell. And you see that here again, when the transcription factors are different and they come in contact with the same cell, the result is a different cell. Okay? So they are doing different functions. They are functionally different cells. And here you see that the natural killer cell precursor is going to give rise to the natural killer cell. Okay? So this is the natural killer cell 1, ILC1 2, ILC2 3, ILC3 4, and LTI 5. These are the 5 cells, lymphoid cells, involved in this process of inflammation or the innate immune response. We call them ILCs, or innate lymphoid cells. Okay? The most studied of all the lymphoid cells is the natural killer cell. You talk about the natural killer cells a bit in detail as compared to others. You know? Have you heard about these innate lymphoid cells before? No. Okay. So these innate lymphoid cells, 1, 2, and 3. These are lymphoid cells. From lymphoid means these are just like lymphocytes. You know? Do you know what kind of lymphocytes are there in the blood? B cells, T cells, natural killer cells, and these lymphocytes are not there in the blood. They are in the tissues. Okay? The natural killer cell is there in the blood, and it would arrive at the site of infection from the blood, just like the neutrophils and other cells that are invited there. But these cells are in the tissues. The T cells and B cells, they are also in the blood and in the lymph. Okay? So the natural killer cells, B cells, T cells, they're all lymphocytes. And these are also lymphocytes that are used in this process of inflammation. Your tissue. Now, if you look at this table, it will become easy for you. The ILC1 to 3, ILC1, 2, and 3, we also call them the helper ILCs, or the helper innate lymphoid cells. Okay? Just like the helper T cells in the case of adaptive immunity. You know about helper T cells? These are helper for what? For the natural killer cells. Natural killer cells are lymphocytes. They are key players in this process of inflammation. And these cells are going to help with the functions of other immune cells, including natural killer cells, macrophages, etc. So, and as I told you that they reside in the tissues, you would find them there in the tissues. And all these ILCs, or the innate lymphoid cells, have pattern recognition receptors. If you look at the T cells or B cells of adaptive immunity, those cells do not have pattern recognition receptors. They have either a T cell receptor or a B cell receptor. And you know that the T cell receptor and B cell receptors are rearrangeable receptors. These cells can rearrange their receptors or do genetic rearrangement in order to create a large diversity of these receptors expressed on their surfaces. In the case of these innate lymphoid cells, the receptors are the natural killer cells even, which is also a lymphocyte. The receptors expressed on their surfaces are not like the TCR or BCR. They are different. They are just the pattern recognition receptors is found on other cells of the innate immune system, or other non-lymphocyte cells, just like the macrophages, mast cells, neutrophils, basophils, etc. Okay? So they are lymphocytes, but they are different with respect to the type of receptor, the nature of receptor on their surfaces. Okay? So here, that's why, because these ILCs can recognize the patterns or the PAMPs with the help of these pattern recognition receptors. That's why they have something to do with the innate immunity. Not adaptive immunity. We are not talking about that right now. But they have a key role in the innate immune response. So if there is intracellular infection with viruses or bacteria or protozoa, or if there is cancer, in all these cases, the innate lymphoid cells that are involved in giving this immediate response against all these pathogens or the cancerous situation would be the natural killer cell and the innate lymphoid cell 1, ILC1. This kind of immunity is known as type 1 immunity or cell-mediated type 1 immunity. Okay? In case of the natural killer cell, it would be type 1 immunity, and there would be cell-mediated cytotoxicity. The natural killer cell would just, target an infected cell and kill it. Okay? The mediators are the things that it would use, the weapons that the natural killer cell has is these perforins, granzymes, interferon gamma. Okay? So when the natural killer cell would come in contact with an infected cell, it would become activated and it would just get rid of that particular cell in this way. The ILC1 mediator by the innate lymphoid cell 1 is interferon gamma. Okay? You remember about interferons? I have told you about type 1 interferons only, not the type 2 interferons. Okay? Interferon gamma is a type 2 interferon. And I would also tell you about many different roles that interferon gamma is going to play. So in ILC1 would again, these are involved in type 1 immunity. And there would be conventional inflammatory activation of the macrophages as happens in the case of infection. Okay? So if there is infection with the virus or bacteria or protozoa, etc., the immediate response, cells that are going to be initially involved in this process of inflammation would be the natural killer cells invited by the macrophages and ILC1, which are there in the tissues, okay? And these are going to kill the pathogens in different ways. The natural killer cells are going to directly target them, and these cells are going to secrete interferon gamma to enhance this inflammatory situation, to activate the macrophages and further, enhance the inflammatory situation so that the macrophage would actively, uh, you know, secrete molecules that can invite other cells, phagocytes, to the site of infection and get rid of the pathogen. Similarly, if these are for the intracellular infections, okay? In case of viruses or intracellular bacteria or protozoa, these two lymphoid cells are involved initially during the inflammatory response. But if the pathogen is extracellular, just like the large multicellular parasites, or if there is some exposure to allergens, then the lymphoid cells involved in that kind of response are the ILC2, which is called the type 2 immunity. Okay? In type 2 immunity, there would be non-inflammatory activation of the macrophage. And the macrophages, they are going to secrete, for instance, interleukin 4 or interleukin 5 or 13. ILC2s are going to secrete these. So these are going to activate the macrophages in a non-inflammatory way. Okay? This is an immunity, type 2 immunity is against the parasites. Okay? When there is some parasitic infection, for instance, in the gut or something, then ILC2 are going to be involved in that process. Then there are extracellular bacterial or fungal infections. If there is, it is an extracellular pathogen, but it's not a parasite, but a bacteria or fungi. In most of the cases, these are extracellular. The lymphoid cell involved in this process is ILC3, and this is going to secrete interleukin 12 and 17. And this would confer type 3 immunity. And what is type 3 immunity? Type 3 immunity is that it is not going to go for a cell-mediated response like killing the cell directly. Rather, indirectly, it would just promote phagocytosis of that particular and secretion of certain antimicrobial peptides that can also do the job. We call this type 3 immunity.
It's written that non-inflammatory activation of the type 2. And that we don't have the inflammation, so it's basically a fever वगैरह inflammation process ही नहीं होगा अगर parasite हमारे पास होगा.
बाज़ केसेस में पैरासिटिक इन्फेक्शन में ये एक डिफरेंट टाइप इनका कोर्स होता है इस इन्फेक्शन का, ठीक है ना? In many cases, you don't even know whether you are infected with some parasite or not. In some cases you would know. And in case of bacterial infection, definitely,
We do have malaria. Malaria is a parasitic infection, right?
Yes.
So when we have malaria, we have high fevers.
Yes.
Doesn't it activate
Now,
the immunity?
I'm telling you about certain parasitic infections, not all of them. There are different pathways for the parasites, some parasites are intracellular, some parasites are extracellular parasites, and they are dealt with by the immune system differently in different ways. So the pathways involved for gastrointestinal tract parasites, for instance, nobody knows whether he has some ascaris or other parasites in them. They don't feel any symptoms like fever or something. And usually people would just diagnose children upon observation first, But if it is an intracellular parasite, then the course of infection, of course, is different. So the type 3 immunity is going to, the cytokines are going to promote this process of phagocytosis. And some of the lymphoid cells, the innate lymphoid cell, just like the lymphoid tissue inducer cell, LTI, these can be influenced by certain ligands, as given here, CXCL13 or rank ligand, etc. And when these are influenced by these ligands, they produce lymphotoxins or tumor necrosis factor. And these tumor necrosis factors and lymphotoxins are helpful with the formation of secondary lymphoid structures, or secondary lymphoid tissues. So this is another job of these, innate lymphoid cells in order to build up more lymphoid masses where the lymphoid cells would reside or make follicles and do their job. Okay? So these are the innate lymphoid cells. You can also read through this description here if you are confused. Defining characteristics of the 5 types of innate lymphoid cells. Type 1 immunity is mediated by natural killer cells, as I told you, ILC1s, neutrophils, and inflammatory macrophages. It defends against many intracellular bacteria and viruses, And then there is type 2 immunity, which is directed at parasites in the gut and is mediated by ILC2s, these lymphoid cells, as well as the mast cells, eosinophils, and basophils. They are involved in parasitic infections, as well as in allergies or hypersensitivities, So type 3 immunity again is mediated by ILC3, as I told you. So you can just go through this stuff for more detail.